The air in Richmond, Virginia, was a living thing. A thick, humid blanket scented with boxwood hedges and history that clung to Maeve Connolly's skin. It was a world away from the crisp, pine-scented austerity of the Idaho panhandle she called home. Here at the prestigious Prescott University College of Medicine, the very architecture seemed to judge her. The colonial brick buildings, with their gleaming white columns and perfectly manicured lawns, whispered of old money and deep-rooted dynasties. Maeve, clutching the faded strap of a backpack that had seen more mountain trails than paved sidewalks, felt like a misplaced patch of lichen on a marble statue. Her work-worn boots, practical for navigating the rocky terrain of northern Idaho, made a clumsy, echoing sound on the polished floors of the main hall. Her flannel-lined jacket, a necessity in the harsh mountain winters, was suffocating in the genteel Virginia autumn. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, or perhaps it was just her imagination, gliding over her, cataloging her otherness. These students moved with an easy, fluid grace, their lives cushioned by a privilege Maeve could barely comprehend. Their casual conversations were peppered with references to summering in the Hamptons and family connections at Johns Hopkins. Maeve's summer had been spent helping her father mend fences and canning vegetables with her mother. She found her name on the roster for gross anatomy and made her way to the enormous amphitheater. The classroom was a coliseum of tiered seating, already buzzing with the confident chatter of her new classmates. Seeking refuge, she climbed to the highest, most shadowed row. But even in the near darkness, she was a beacon. "Well, well, Hunter, do you see that?" A voice, dripping with theatrical amusement, cut through the din. "I believe we have a special guest from the cast of Deliverance." Maeve's gaze fell to a privileged circle in the lower rows. At its center was Hunter Radcliffe II, son of the renowned Dr. Maxwell Radcliffe, the Dean of Medicine. Known on campus simply as Hunt, he was impossibly handsome, with a lazy, arrogant smirk that seemed permanently affixed to his face. He leaned back in his chair, a king on his throne, surrounded by a court of young men and women who looked like they'd been born in J. Crew catalogs. "Be nice, Pierce," Hunt drawled, though his eyes were filled with mockery as they scanned Maeve from her worn boots to her simple ponytail. She probably got a perfect score on the MCATs. It's a requirement for the university's diversity initiative. Gotta get some of that authentic rural flavor. A wave of cruel, polished laughter followed. Maeve's face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the Virginia humidity. She had an almost physical urge to flee, to be back in the quiet solitude of the Idaho forests, where the only judgment came from the watchful eyes of a deer. There, she was Maeve Connolly, her grandmother's gifted apprentice, the girl who knew every healing plant in the Selkirk Mountains. Here, she was a caricature, a charity case, a hick. Then, she felt a familiar calm settle over her, a feeling anchored by her grand's voice from a memory years ago. They had been sitting on the porch, her grand's gnarled hands showing her how to strip elderberries from their stems. "Don't you mind them, Maeve girl," her gran had said, her voice as steady as the mountains themselves. "Folks who build themselves up by tearing others down are standing on weak ground. True strength is quiet. It listens more than it talks. It just waits for the moment it's needed." Maeve straightened her spine. She deliberately pulled her worn leather-bound journal from her backpack, its cover softened with age, and a set of pens. She wasn't here for their acceptance. She was here to fulfill a promise to her grandmother, to merge the old ways with the new. She was here to learn. The lecture began, and as the image of the human heart filled the giant screen, Maeve focused with an intensity that blocked out everything else. She didn't know it then. But a heart was about to fail in this very city, and all their modern science would be useless, and her quiet strength would be all that stood between a man and his grave. The weeks crawled by, each one cementing Maeve's status as a pariah with a perfect GPA. In the sterile, objective world of exams and labs, she was a prodigy. During a notoriously difficult neurology seminar, Professor Davies posed a question about a rare prion disease that stumped the entire class. The room fell silent, the only sound the nervous shuffling of papers. Even Hunt, who usually managed to bluff his way through any situation, could only offer a vague, rambling non-answer. After a long pause, Maeve's quiet voice filled the room. "It's a mutation in the PRNP gene that causes a misfolding cascade. But the key is that it presents with symptoms mimicking Lambert-Eaton syndrome, not Creutzfeldt-Jakob. The differential diagnosis would hinge on a negative acetylcholine receptor antibody test. Professor Davies stared at her, his eyebrows raised in genuine astonishment. "That is absolutely correct, Miss Connolly. Precisely the point I was hoping someone would make." Hunt Radcliffe shot her a look of pure venom. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was incensed that the class mascot had outshone him. From that day on, the taunts escalated. They were no longer just about her clothes or her accent, but about the very core of her knowledge. They called her the Idaho Witch, and joked about her brewing potions in her dorm room. Her solace was her journal. It was more than a notebook. It was a sacred text, a direct link to her grandmother's spirit. It held detailed sketches of plants, notes on dosages, and stories of healing passed down through generations. It was a testament to a science that was far older than Prescott University. One rainy evening, she sought refuge in a quiet, forgotten corner of the university's vast library, surrounded by dusty medical texts from the 19th century. When she finally packed up to leave, the main halls were deserted. As she stepped out into the misty, gas-lit courtyard, she found her path blocked. It was Hunt and two of his friends, their expensive loafers soaked, their expressions bored and predatory. "Look what we have here," Hunt said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty square. "Leaving your cauldron unattended, are we?" Before she could react, his friend Pierce snatched the journal from her grasp. "Let's see the secret spells," he sneered, flipping through the pages with theatrical disdain. "Ah, marsh elder for fevers. Stonebriar. What's this? A recipe for poison?" He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This is pathetic." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the journal. It landed with a sickening, heavy plop in the center of a large, murky puddle. The hand-drawn illustrations and her grandmother's cursive, painstakingly copied, began to bleed into an inky mess. A physical pain shot through Maeve's chest. It felt as if he had thrown her own heart into that dirty water. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she would die before she let them see her cry. A cold, hard fury she didn't know she possessed rose up to meet the pain. She walked forward, her steps deliberate, reached into the cold, gritty water, and retrieved her ruined book. She clutched it to her chest, the muddy water soaking the front of her jacket, and turned to face them. She didn't say a word. She just looked at Hunt, her gaze so steady and so full of quiet contempt that he, for the first time, actually looked away. She walked back to her dorm, their fading laughter chasing her. That night, under the sterile glow of her desk lamp, she began the painstaking work of saving her heritage. With a delicate touch, she separated the damp pages, blow-drying each one, her grief slowly hardening into resolve. She would not let them break her. She would master their science, she would pass their exams, and she would hold on to her own knowledge. And one day, she would show them that the wisdom they scorned was more powerful than they could ever imagine. The practiced, orderly rhythm of Prescott University Hospital shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The disruption began not with a siren, but with a whisper that spread through the wards like a contagion. "Orion Wolf is here." The name alone commanded a kind of reverence and fear. Wolf was a titan of technology, a digital phantom who had reshaped the world and then vanished from public view, becoming a modern myth. His fortune was legendary, his influence absolute. And now, he was a patient in their most exclusive wing. An army of the hospital's best and brightest was summoned to the penthouse suite, a phalanx led by a visibly stressed Dean Maxwell Radcliffe. His son, Hunt, trailed in his wake, trying to project an air of calm authority he clearly didn't feel. As a third-year student, Maeve should have been miles away, but her rotation that day was in central supply on the top floor. She was tasked with restocking carts, a menial job that suddenly gave her a front-row seat to the unfolding crisis. The problem was terrifyingly simple. No one had any idea what was wrong with Orion Wolf. He had been admitted via a private entrance for what his personal physician called a bout of vertigo. But in the space of 3 hours, his condition had spiraled into a catastrophic multi-system failure. His heart was firing erratically, creating a bizarre, chaotic rhythm on the monitors that defied every known diagnosis. His blood pressure swung wildly from dangerously high to terrifyingly low. Every test, from a full toxicology panel to an emergency MRI of his brain, came back maddeningly, impossibly normal. Maeve pushed a cart of sterile supplies down the hushed, carpeted hallway, catching snippets of panicked conversation from the doctors huddled outside Wolf's suite. "It presents like a cholinergic crisis, but there's no response to atropine," one specialist argued. "The fibrillation pattern is all wrong. It's not VFib, it's chaos," another countered, his voice tight with disbelief. From inside the suite, she could hear Dean Radcliffe's strained, angry voice on the phone. "No, I don't have an answer yet. We are exploring every... Just tell the board I have it under control." As a nurse rushed out of the suite, the door swung open for a brief moment. Maeve caught a glimpse of the billionaire in the bed. His skin had a ghastly gray pallor, but what caught her eye was a faint, lattice-like rash spreading across his exposed neck and the back of his hands, a delicate violet web under the skin. At the same instant, a strange scent drifted into the hall. It was subtle, almost lost beneath the smell of antiseptic, but it stopped her cold. It was sweet but deeply earthy, the smell of damp soil and something else, something faintly, cloyingly floral. The scent was a key turning a lock in the deepest part of her memory. It was the smell of the deep woods after a long rain, the smell her grandmother had warned her about. Her heart began to pound. She looked at the frantic, brilliant doctors, with all their machines and all their data, and a terrible certainty began to dawn. They were looking in all the wrong places. The answer wasn't on their computer screens. It was in a story her grandmother had told her about a poisonous plant called stonebriar. The controlled chaos in the hallway intensified. A crash cart was wheeled to the door of the suite, a stark symbol of impending failure. "He's throwing PVCs every third beat. We're going to lose him if we can't break this arrhythmia," a cardiologist yelled, his voice cracking with strain. That was the final piece. The violet web, the earthy sweet smell, the untreatable cardiac chaos. It wasn't a disease. It was poison. The memory hit Maeve not as a thought, but as a fully formed scene from her childhood. She was 12, watching her grandmother work. A surveyor from Boise, a man full of city confidence, had been brought to their cabin, carried by two local loggers. He was pale and sweating, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird. He'd been foraging, he'd said, and had eaten a delicious, nutty root he'd found near a rocky outcrop. Her grandmother had taken one look at him, sniffed the air around his head, and immediately set a pot of water to boil. "That's stonebriar," her gran had said to Maeve in a low voice, her expression grim. "The root looks like a wild potato, and it smells sweet when it's bruised. The city folk think it's a treat, but the poison shuts down the heart's rhythm. The doctors in town don't know it. They see a heart attack and give the wrong medicine, which only makes it worse." Maeve had watched, mesmerized, as her grandmother ignored all the common remedies. Instead, she'd gone to a specific jar in her pantry filled with the dried, papery leaves of marsh elder, a humble plant that grew in the swampy parts of the valley. She'd brewed a dark, bitter-smelling tea and forced the barely conscious man to drink it, spoonful by spoonful. Within an hour, the man's color had returned, and his pulse had steadied. It was a miracle born not of magic, but of knowledge. A knowledge so ancient it was dismissed as folklore by men like Dr. Radcliffe. A cold sweat broke out on Maeve's forehead. She was sure. She was as sure as she was of her own name. But the chasm between her certainty and her ability to act seemed impossibly wide. She was a student, a nobody. If she was wrong, her dream of becoming a doctor would be over before it began. They would not just expel her, they would make an example of her. But if she was right, and she did nothing... She looked at Hunt Radcliffe, who was now standing beside his father, a portrait of impotent privilege. They were beaten. Their science had failed. And she, the girl they had ridiculed for her backwoods heritage, held the one and only key. The weight of that knowledge was immense. Her grandmother's words came back to her, clear as a bell. "There's a great sin in this world, Maeve. It's not ignorance. It's knowing how to help and choosing to stay silent." The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the duty was greater. This was the moment her whole life had prepared her for. This was her grandmother's legacy in action. She set her jaw, pushed her supply cart against the wall, and began walking toward the knot of desperate, powerful men, her worn boots making a slow, determined sound on the polished floor. Maeve pushed through the outer ring of nurses and entered the tense circle of doctors. The conversation stopped. Dean Maxwell Radcliffe looked up, his face a mask of exhausted fury. "What is it? What do you want?" "It's not a medical condition," Maeve said, her voice shaking only slightly. "It's poison, stonebriar root. It's an alkaloid that standard toxicology panels are blind to. It hyperpolarizes the cardiac cells, inducing chaotic fibrillation. Your antiarrhythmic drugs are just adding to the cardiac load." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then Hunt exploded. "Are you insane? Get her out of here. Dad, she's completely lost it. She's babbling about folktales while a man is dying." A toxicologist in the group scoffed. "We ran a full-spectrum mass spectrometry, young lady. If there was an unknown organic compound, we would have flagged it." "You wouldn't unless you knew what to look for," Maeve retorted, her confidence surging. "The molecular weight is similar to common amino acids. It gets lost in the noise. But the symptoms are unmistakable. The web-like rash is caused by microhemorrhaging in the capillaries. The earthy smell is the compound being metabolized through the skin. I know what this is." Dr. Radcliffe stared at her, his mind reeling. Everything she said was outlandish, a complete violation of protocol, yet she spoke with an authority that was unnerving. He was a man of science, of data and double-blind studies, but his science had failed. He looked from Maeve's fierce, certain eyes to the monitor displaying the dying heartbeat of Orion Wolf. They were seconds away from calling a time of death. "There's an antidote," Maeve pressed, her voice dropping, becoming more urgent. "A simple infusion of Menanthes trifoliata, marsh elder. It contains a glycoside that acts as a chelating agent for the specific alkaloid in stonebriar. It will bind to it and render it inert. You can find a tincture of it in any well-stocked herbalist shop." "This is the most irresponsible, dangerous nonsense I have ever heard," Hunt shouted, his face contorted with rage. "You are going to let this witch doctor kill him with snake oil?" But his father wasn't listening to him anymore. Maxwell Radcliffe was looking at the precipice. On one side was certain failure and the ruin of his reputation. On the other was a wild, 1 in a billion chance, proposed by the most unlikely person in the hospital. He was a gambler with one chip left. He locked eyes with Maeve, his expression grim. "If you are wrong, Missy Connolly," he said, his voice low and deadly serious, "I will not just see you expelled. I will personally see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Your life in medicine, or any other field, will be over." He then turned to his terrified personal assistant. "Find an herbalist shop that delivers. Get me marsh elder. Go, now!" The 15 minutes that followed were a masterclass in suspended time. The assistant, after a frantic series of calls, had located a small, dusty apothecary in the city's old quarter that stocked the tincture. A courier was racing across Richmond with the tiny vial that held Orion Wolf's life in the balance. The hallway outside the penthouse suite became a silent tableau of tension. Maeve stood against the wall, feeling every eye on her, every silent judgment. Hunt paced back and forth like a caged wolf, his face a thunderous storm of rage and anxiety. He stopped in front of her, his voice a low, vicious sneer. "I hope you're proud of yourself. When his heart stops for good in about 5 minutes, his estate is going to sue this hospital into a crater. And I'm going to make sure the world knows it was all because of you, Maeve Connolly from Nowhere, Idaho." Maeve met his gaze but didn't speak. Her own heart was hammering against her ribs. Doubt, cold and sharp, tried to pierce the armor of her certainty. What if she was wrong? What if there was some other variable? What if her grandmother's knowledge, so powerful in the mountains, didn't translate to this world of concrete and steel? The courier arrived, a blur of motion, handing the small package to Dr. Radcliffe. The dean looked at the simple, handwritten label, Marsh Elder, Menanthes trifoliata, as if it were an alien artifact. "The dosage," he demanded, not looking at Maeve. 10 milliliters in a saline drip, infuse it over 10 minutes, no faster," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The medical team disappeared into the suite. The door clicked shut, a sound of finality. Maeve was left in the hallway with Hunt and the relentless, chaotic beeping of the cardiac monitor on the wall. Beep, 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 beep. It was the sound of a dying heart. 1 minute passed, 2, 5. The rhythm remained a frantic, discordant mess. Hunt's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. He was certain he was about to witness her spectacular downfall. And then a change. It was almost imperceptible at first. A single solid rhythmic beep emerged from the chaos. Beep, then a pause, then another. Beep. A nurse inside the suite gasped. On the monitor, the frantic, jagged green line faltered, and then, miraculously, began to resolve into a familiar, rolling wave. The frantic beeping slowed, steadied, and solidified into the most beautiful sound in the world. Beep, beep, beep. The strong, unwavering rhythm of a healthy human heart. The door flew open. Dean Radcliffe stood there, his face utterly drained of color. He looked not at his son, but directly at Maeve, his expression a mixture of profound shock and something akin to holy terror. The smirk on Hunt's face dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed gape of disbelief. He stared at the monitor, then at Maeve, then back at the monitor, his entire worldview crumbling in real time. It wasn't a procedure. It wasn't a drug from a billion-dollar lab. It was a simple plant from a swamp, administered based on the word of a girl from Idaho. It was a miracle, and it had just saved the life of Orion Wolf. Orion Wolf awoke to the quiet, rhythmic beeping of the monitor that had, hours earlier, been screaming his death warrant. He felt weak, as if he'd been pulled through a keyhole, but his mind, the source of his vast fortune, was as sharp as ever. Dean Radcliffe was at his bedside instantly, his face arranged in an expression of grave, professional success. "Mr. Wolf, you gave us quite a scare. A severe, idiopathic cardiac event, but my team and I were able to—" "Save it, Maxwell." Wolf's voice was a hoarse whisper, but it cut through the dean's platitudes like a razor. "I wasn't fully unconscious. I heard things. I heard about folk tales and witch doctors. And I heard a young woman's voice. Bring her to me." A muscle twitched in Radcliffe's jaw. The moment of glory he had envisioned was gone. Defeated, he sent for Maeve. She entered the opulent suite, her simple clothes a stark contrast to the luxurious furnishings, feeling small and intensely vulnerable. Orion Wolf beckoned her closer. He studied her face for a long time, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. Not the anxiety, not the exhaustion, and not the quiet strength that radiated from her. Hunt, summoned by his father to witness this exchange, stood stiffly in the corner, a silent statue of fury. "You're Maeve Connolly," Wolf stated, not asked. Maeve nodded, unable to speak. "Tell me," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "They have millions of dollars of diagnostic equipment. They are the best in their field. You beat them with a story about a weed. Why?" Finding her voice, Maeve told him everything. She spoke of her grandmother, of a worldview where healing was about listening, to the patient, to the land, to the stories passed down through generations. She explained that nature was a complex library of compounds, and that modern science, for all its power, had only read a few of the books. She spoke not with arrogance, but with the simple, profound conviction of someone stating a fundamental truth. Orion Wolf listened, his expression unreadable. He was a man who had built an empire by identifying patterns and talent that others missed. He had become a billionaire by betting on outsiders, on disruptive ideas that the establishment ridiculed, and he recognized the same spark in the young woman before him. "I came from nothing, Miss Connolly," Wolf said suddenly, his gaze shifting to the Radcliffes. "I grew up in a place not so different from your Idaho. I've spent 40 years surrounded by men like these. Men who inherit their titles and their confidence, men who believe their own press releases. They are custodians of the known. You are a discoverer of what has been forgotten." He looked back at Maeve. "They laughed at you." Again, it was a statement. Maeve's silence was her answer. "I see," Wolf said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Thank you for saving my life. I will not forget it. You may go now." Then, as Maeve turned to leave, he added, "As for you two, you will stay." We have a great many things to discuss regarding the future of my relationship with this institution." The promise in his voice was colder and more threatening than any outright shout. 2 days later, the Prescott University Board of Trustees convened for an emergency meeting in the grand, wood-paneled boardroom. The air was thick with anticipation. Dean Radcliffe and his son Hunt sat near the end of the table, their faces grim. At the opposite end, next to the university president, sat Maeve Connolly, feeling like an astronaut who had landed on the wrong planet. A moment later, Orion Wolf entered, looking as if he'd spent the last week at a health spa, not a hospital bed. He took his place at the head of the table, and a deferential silence fell. "Good morning," Wolf began, his voice calm but resonant with absolute authority. "I've donated to many institutions in my life, hospitals, universities, museums. I have always considered it a simple transaction, but my recent experience here has inspired me to make a more personal, a more transformative investment." The board members leaned forward, their faces alight with the prospect of a massive donation. "I will be endowing this university with a grant of $500 million, Wolf announced. Gasps echoed around the room. The president looked euphoric. "However," Wolf continued, and every smile vanished, "this is not a gift, it is a seed. And it comes with non-negotiable terms." His gaze swept the room, finally landing on Maeve. "I am funding the creation of the Wolf Center for Natural and Integrative Medicine. Its mission will be to scientifically validate and integrate the vast, untapped world of ethnobotany and traditional healing into the medical mainstream. We will take the folklore you so readily dismiss, and we will subject it to the most rigorous scientific scrutiny. We will find the next generation of drugs not in a sterile lab, but in the wisdom of the mountains, the deserts, and the swamps." He paused, letting the revolutionary concept sink in. "Upon completion of her MD and PhD, which my foundation will fully fund at any institution she chooses anywhere in the world, the directorship of this center will be offered to Dr. Maeve Connolly. Her first project will be a comprehensive study of the neuroactive compounds found in the flora of the American Northwest, starting with a plant called stonebriar." He then fixed his piercing gaze on the Radcliffes. "Dean Radcliffe, you will remain in your post, but your department's research budget will now be subject to review by the Wolf Center's governing board, a board which I will chair. And you, Hunter," he said, his voice dropping to an icy calm, "your residency application here has been noted. I trust that during your remaining time as a student, you will endeavor to learn that a physician's greatest tool is not his ego, but his ears. You might learn a great deal from observing Miss Connolly." It was a public vivisection, performed with surgical precision. Hunt stared at the polished table, his face the color of raw meat, his world shattered. After the meeting, as the stunned board members dispersed, Maeve found herself face to face with Hunt in the empty corridor. He looked at her, his expression a chaotic wreck of fury, humiliation, and a maddening flicker of something she had never seen from him before: respect. He opened his mouth, but choked on the words, unable to form an apology or an insult. Maeve simply held his gaze for a long moment. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only the quiet, unshakable calm of the mountains she came from. Then she gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod and walked away, down the long hall toward her future. The quiet had been broken. The waiting was over. Her time had begun.